Wow, Liz, this chapter on rope dynamics is pretty intense. I didn't realize how much there was to consider when working with ropes, especially in climbing or rescue situations.
Absolutely, Sam. It's crucial to understand the forces involved when we load ropes and connect equipment. These aren't just random bits of gear. They're all part of a system, and a weak link could lead to disaster. That's why PPE laws in Europe are so strict about the quality of this equipment.
Right, and the concept of linking items together to form a chain is pretty interesting. I hadn't really thought about how each piece of equipment needs to be of similar strength. If we don't understand the dynamics, we could easily misuse something and create a weak link in that chain.
Exactly. That's where understanding the difference between static and dynamic ropes comes in, too. We know that rope failures are rare, but when they do happen, it's usually due to something like a rope rubbing on a sharp or angular edge while under tension. If we don't manage those edges properly, we're asking for trouble.
Yeah, I noticed that. The section on edges was eye-opening. It's not just about avoiding edges but also about how to protect the rope if you can't avoid them. Padding the rope, padding the edge, improvising a roller, or using a pulley to change the rope's direction, all seem like simple but effective ways to prevent damage.
Definitely. And when they mention padding the rope, I found it interesting that even a stationary rope can move enough to get damaged. Professional teams carry rope protectors, but if you don't have those, something as simple as wrapping a few layers of repair tape around the rope can be a lifesaver.
That's good to know. I also like the tip about edge padding using an old piece of clothing or a dry bag. It's a clever way to use what you have on hand if you don't have professional edge protectors.
Absolutely. Improvising with a driftwood log for rollers is another great idea. It's all about reducing friction and preventing damage, which is critical when you're tensioning or hoisting ropes.
Speaking of friction, the explanation of knots and hitches was pretty enlightening. I hadn't realized how much strength a rope loses when it's tied into a knot. Most knots create a weaker link, which can be a problem depending on the situation.
That's why it's important to choose the right knot or hitch for the job. The Italian hitch, for example, is a friction hitch that's really versatile. It can be used when you need to control the rope, and it's strong enough to hold as much force as the system can handle. Plus, it's easy to lock off and release later, even under tension.
That's a handy knot to know. The section on carabiners also made me think twice about how I use them. I always assumed it was fine to clip them together, but the book warns that this can actually create a weak point in the system if they get twisted.
Yeah, that's a common mistake. Carabiners should always be used to link ropes and tapes, not clipped to each other. It's one of those small details that can make a huge difference in the safety of your setup.
And anchors. There's so much to consider when setting up an anchor. It's not just about finding a strong point but also making sure it's in the right direction for the pull. And if there's any doubt about the anchor's reliability, using multiple anchors is the way to go.
Right, and that part about angles was crucial. If the angle between your anchors is too wide, you're actually increasing the load on each anchor, which can make the system less stable. Keeping the angle below 60 degrees is ideal to avoid unnecessary strain.
That makes sense. I hadn't realized that at a 120 degrees angle, the load is the same as using just one anchor, and at 160 degrees, it's nearly 3 times the force. That's a huge difference.
It really is. And when you're linking anchors, the choice between self-equalizing and linked independent anchors depends on the situation. Self-equalizing anchors are great for certain scenarios, like hauling, where the load might shift. But they're not ideal for situations involving gravity, where a sudden shock load could be dangerous.
Exactly. If one anchor fails, you don't want the remaining anchors to be shock-loaded. That's where linked independent anchors come in handy. They distribute the load evenly without shock-loading the system if one anchor gives way.
It's all about balancing the pros and cons depending on the situation. The section on mechanical advantage was also really interesting. It's crazy to think that with a 2:1 pulley system, you only need half the force to move a load, but you have to pull twice the length of rope.
Yeah, and the more pulleys you add, the more rope you need to pull. It's a trade-off, less force but more rope and time. The pig rig system they mentioned seemed like a smart way to maximize rope length, especially when you're dealing with long distances.
The pig rig is really clever. It lets you use the full length of your rope, or even multiple ropes tied together, by piggybacking one system onto another. And passing a knot through the system without untying and readying everything is a nice touch, especially in a rescue scenario where time is critical.
Absolutely. It's these practical solutions that make all the difference in high-pressure situations. And friction, let's not forget about that. Even with pulleys, some of the mechanical advantage is lost to friction. If you're using carabiners instead of pulleys, the loss is even greater.
True. There's a point where adding more pulleys doesn't give you any more advantage because the friction eats up the gains. It's all about understanding the diminishing returns and knowing when to stop.
This chapter really drives home how essential it is to understand the physics and mechanics behind what we're doing. It's not just about having the right gear, it's about using it correctly and understanding the forces at play.
Exactly. The more we understand the dynamics, the better we can prepare and avoid potentially dangerous situations. It's all about safety and efficiency out there.